members, it is about time we have attained the quorum. I'd like to welcome you all to this special House Committee meeting. Let's invite the administration in, please. Our regular House Committee, or this special meeting, will end at 4, and the regular House Committee will proceed immediately afterwards. Just a reminder that for those members who wish to put questions, please press the Request to Speak button. And in deciding on the members' order, I will have regard to the number of questions raised, members' political party groupings, before deciding on the order of members to speak. Please be reminded that members should be precise and concise. It will be restricted to 5 minutes, including the question and answer. And we're going to have a verbatim record as per usual practice. We have made available the papers, CB2 1281/1415 Population Policy Strategies and Initiatives. Background brief on population policy by the Secretariat, CB2 1281/1415 and also the information note on population profile of Hong Kong, INO 7/1714. I'd like to welcome the CS, Mr. Matthew Cheung, Secretary for Labour and Welfare, Mr. Lai Chung Kwok, Secretary for Security, Mr. Eddie Ng, Secretary for Education, Mr. Paul Tang, Secretary for Civil Service, and also, last but not least, Ms. Doris Ho, Head of Policy and Project Coordination Unit, CS Office. CS, I hand the floor over to you for a brief introductory remarks. Thank you, Chairman. I will make it very brief, and I will leave more time for members' questions. First of all, I'd like to thank the Chairman for arranging this special meeting for us to discuss with members the policy in the policy address. On the day the policy address was delivered, we published this document on population policy strategies and initiatives. I'm here together with four bureau secretaries to discuss with members. In fact, other bureaus are also involved in the Steering Committee on Population Policy. If members recall, on 2 occasions I attended the House Committee meetings to listen to members' views regarding population policy. Over the past 2 years, we have conducted a public engagement exercise to collect public views regarding population policy. Our demographic structure is creating a lot of challenges. We have an aging population, low fertility rate. Our labor force will be shrinking. The dependency ratio will worsen. And the economic growth in Hong Kong will experience a slowdown. And this is high time we discussed and dealt with the population issues. Population policy covers a number of different areas. We have reconstituted the Steering Committee on Population Policy. We have homed in on specific areas in order not to overlap with the areas that already been dealt with by other bureaus. Of course, this includes land supply, housing, healthcare, elderly services, and public finance. So the SCPP over the past 2 years focused its attention on the areas other than the areas that are already mentioned, in particular manpower and human capital. In this document, we have 5 major strategies and a package of 50 different initiatives. Some of them have already been implemented. In the panels, some of them were discussed. like the retirement age of the new recruits of the civil service, starting from June for civilian grade, it will be extended to 60 to 65, and disciplined services from 50 to 55. And for Cat B, security personnel will be relaxed from 65 to 70. And in his budget, the Financial Secretary also proposed that the child allowance will go up from $70,000 to $100,000. For the importation of talent scheme, we have enhanced the details. Now, this is not a one-off exercise. Population policy is an ongoing exercise in the light of the new challenges, and also in the light of the effectiveness of the existing measures. We will consider whether we need to put in place new measures or enhance existing measures. So we have the SCPP, which is chaired by me. Other than the SCPP discussion, we also, on 2 occasions per year, invite experts and stakeholders to engage them in these discussions and communications. So, Chairman, going forward, if necessary, I will be only delighted to come down here to the House Committee to engage with members for discussions on population policy. Mr. Chen Heke and then Dr. Martin Liao. Chairman, thank you. Thanks very much, CS and her team for being with us. Chairman, page 2, paragraph 45, about the cross-boundary marriages. According to some statistics over the past 5 years, these cross-boundary marriages have increased 7-fold of the registered marriages. 40% are cross-boundary marriages. I'd like to put this to the CS in terms of housing, welfare, education. Now, for these policy bureaus, when decisions are taken, would they have regard to the social implications arising from these cross-boundary marriages and the additional demand for services? I learned from a recent report that there is an increasing trend for Hong Kong women marrying mainland males, and divorces after 1 or 2 years after marriages have also increased, and the number of single-parent families will also go up in numbers as a result. Does the government have any particular services for these kind of families? CS? Chairman, let me take the question first, and I call upon the Secretary for Security to talk about the immigration policy. In terms of the statistics, the cross-boundary marriages registered in Hong Kong, the spouses being mainland resident situations like this. 2014, for the provisional statistics, cross-boundary marriages take up 36.6% of the locally registered marriages. Now, the statistics are pretty stable. From 2007 through to now, the figure hovers around 35 to 40%. Now, the other argument is that other than locally registered marriages, there are also marriages registered in the mainland. Now, we look at the certificate for singletons being issued in Hong Kong. The statistics show that in 2013, we don't have the 2014 figure. In 2013, we have 5,580. So for those who get the singleton certificate and they get married across the boundary, the number stands at 26,000. The other phenomenon, like Mr. Chen said earlier on, there are marriages involving the woman being Hong Kong people. Number has also gone up, 2,490, going up to 5,435 in 2014, double the number. Now, the marriages involving the male being Hong Kong people, 16,000, 15,000 or thereabout. It has been pretty stable. Mr. Chen is concerned that for these cross-boundary marriages, the spouses are coming to Hong Kong on one-way permits. In terms of the overall services for the one-way permit holders, we would factor in the level of services that we provide. When the bureaus make provision for housing, education, and welfare, we would also already cater for these one-way permit holders. Now, for new arrivals, for these spouses coming on one-way permits, they're new arrivals. When they come to Hong Kong, the SWD, the HAD would also make available specific services for their new arrivals so that they would get accustomed to Hong Kong's situation and get integrated. We welcome them to join the workforce, as well as I said earlier, one of the challenges in relation to demographics in Hong Kong is the lack of manpower. Perhaps I defer to Mr. Lai, S4S. Now, whether the spouses from the mainland, males or females, the one-way permit doesn't make any difference at all. The waiting time is 4 years. It takes them 4 years for them to acquire or chalk up the right number of points, and then they will be awarded the one-way permit to come to Hong Kong. In the interim period, they are also allowed to make application for visit to Hong Kong for a period of 90 days each time, 3 times a year. Dr. Martin Liao, Chairman. The government set up the SCPP in order to map out the long-term policies. A lot of policies seem to be rather haphazard without any long-term vision. Like the talent scheme, talent admission scheme, we have adjusted the GEP, the admission scheme for mainland talents and professionals and QMAS, and also the importation of second generation Hong Kong people, which was announced in the policy address. 3 months on, the website of the Immigration Department said that this will be launched in the second quarter of this year without any specific implementation date. In the policy address, it announced that it will look into other countries' example to put together a talents list in order to lure high-quality, high-caliber talents into Hong Kong. But we haven't heard anything since. Has the study really started? Also, the capital investment entrance scheme, since January the 15th, it has been halted, has been suspended. Now, what is going to happen to the future of the capital investment entrance scheme? How is the government going to deal with this scheme going forward? All these measures seem to be rather fragmented and pretty uncertain. So my question for the CS is how instrumental are these measures to attracting talents to Hong Kong? CS? I will deal with questions briefly, and then I'll be calling upon the SLW to address the questions. Like I said in the introductory remarks, the population policy covers a broad spectrum of areas. It cuts across different bureaus, and a lot of work undertaken by the bureaus has to do with population. So when we talk about population policy, we basically are talking about the work of the entire SAR administration. So it may give Ms. Dr. Liao a perception that we don't have a comprehensive set of policy. But Mr. Liao can rest assured that the SCPP will look at different areas to make sure that we will be able to deal with the challenges in a more holistic manner. And we have this consideration in the formulation of policies. Called upon the S4S to talk about the importation of labor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me give a reply to Dr. Liao's point. In the policy address, a series of initiatives have been announced in relation to the attraction of talents from outside. We have said that in Q2 we will do something about it. We need more time. This is because we need to get ready in relation to the details, like publication of the leaflets. We want to have it drafted properly so that when it is announced, it will be easily comprehensible. So we're still working on the actual wording. We want to make sure that it is clear and we can get our message across clearly. Therefore, we are in the final stage of fine-tuning the message. We believe that within the short term, we'll be able to make a formal announcement as to how it will be carried out. Of course, the honourable member also talked about the capital investment entrance scheme. When we announced the suspension, there was a backlog of about 15,000 cases. And in accordance with the pace of processing the applications, and based on the same number of officers deployed and the same amount of resources earmarked, we believe that it will take us 3 to 4 years' time to clear the backlog. So for the time being, as far as the capital investment entrance scheme is concerned, as to the way forward, I'm afraid that at this stage it is too early to make a comment, as it will still take a few years' time to complete the process. And then for investment and investors, we will be announcing clearer criteria and will await the outcome of that exercise as well. Therefore, for the time being, I'm afraid that for the CIES, we won't have much else to say. Mr. Zheng, SLW, any brief supplementary remarks? Yes, about the importation of labor. Yes, there is some substantive progress. The Development Bureau has also announced a statement saying that there was a report made to the Labour Advisory Board, hoping that within this quarter we can further refine the existing scheme. Mr. Tommy Zheng. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I may turn to page 58 of the Chinese version of your report, and that's about attracting talents from outside and also the second generation of migrants. Of course, I went overseas very early, and I have already come back for a long time. My children were brought up in Hong Kong. My daughter and my son-in-law were trained as medical doctors overseas, but I don't see anything in your report to attract them to come back to Hong Kong to practice. For such talents, unfortunately, they decided to study overseas for a profession. But then, for the Medical Council, it is outrageous in that we have got many medical practitioners in the private practice sitting on the committee, and so their thresholds were so high that they might not even be able to pass their own licensing examination. So they're reluctant to allow newcomers to compete for business with them. Now, if you allow the Medical Council to carry on like this, and had Dr. Cole been here, he would of course have said that one more exam has been held and then the passing rate is higher. But this is nonsense. We'd like to talk about Singapore, and we have got Mr. Matthew Zheng, and whenever we talk about standard working hours, we challenge Mr. Zheng for saying that why don't we have standard working hours like Singapore? We have statutory minimum wage, but they haven't got it in Singapore. In Singapore, they are very interested in inviting overseas medical doctors to go there to practice, quite unlike the case in Hong Kong. And I find it outrageous. As I have said it many times in this conference room, that maybe 2 or 3 years ago, had we asked our principal officials, even for CS, who's so capable, you might not be able to sit and pass the Hong Kong CEE and get a pass if you are made to read the exam papers. Now, the pandemicrists agree with me in relation to the bad practice of the Medical Council. The other day, I heard Dr. Joseph Sung saying that for CU and Hong Kong U, they have got different views, but then they shared one view, that is there should be relaxation about the criteria for the licensing examination for overseas trained doctors. So both universities welcome the relaxation of the criteria, but so far little has been done and few have come back. Now I have declared that my daughter and my son-in-law were overseas trained, but they're not interested to come back. So I'm not fighting for the interests of my family members. However, I think you have resisted doing this, and in fact many professionals, lawyers, accountants, and other professionals who are also overseas trained have also been turned away. Of course, I'm not too familiar about other professions. So CS4A, please answer this question. Make sure that you don't allow the Medical Council members to have it their way and reject overseas trained doctors to come here to practice so that there will be competition. CS4A. For the concern expressed by Mr. Tommy Cheung, that is whether we will be facilitating the practice in Hong Kong by overseas trained doctors, especially those who are Hong Kong residents. I think many people shared this view. I think many people would agree with him. Within the government, we believe that it is something we need to face squarely. I understand that the Secretary for Food and Health has been working very hard to talk to the Hong Kong Medical Council. As far as the figures are concerned, we have seen an increase for the 2 years, 2012 and 2013, for non-locally trained medical doctors. 47 and 46 doctors passed the exams respectively. Last year, there were 2 exams every year. In 2014, 73 doctors were able to pass the exams. The government is still liaising with the Medical Council in enhancing the system, like relaxing the need for intern service so that more graduates can come to Hong Kong to have the internship. I will certainly urge the Secretary for Food and Health to follow this up. Mr. Chairman, can I have a quick follow-up? I don't think you have time. Mr. Ng Leung Sing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As to how this is to be followed up, I think there is still some sense of protectionism in certain professions. Now, medical doctors may say that they are there to save the lives of the patients, but what is important is to make sure that we find it more accessible to have health and medical service. So the CS4A is duty-bound to talk to the professions, hold a public debate, and find out why they are standing in the way, preventing more medical doctors from coming to Hong Kong to serve the citizens of Hong Kong. I think we can have a public debate about that. Now I turn to my own question. In paragraph 9D, you talk about supporting mature workers to work. I think it is a very important component. The other day, we've noted a news story. There was a man in his 70s. He didn't want to apply for CSSA. Of course, it wasn't a proper way to deal with it. He tried to get an identification paper so as to make sure that he would not appear to be overage. He would like to act as a security personnel. He was sent to jail for 3 months. He has got the sympathy of many citizens. He would rather be on his own than rely on CSSA. So has good intentions in mind, but then by resorting to a forged document, it is most improper. So in relation to our support to help the mature workers to work, have we done enough? What can be done to make sure that there will be fewer people relying on CSSA, because this is a wastage of resources. Some recipients have used the money to go to Thailand for a holiday, and the story was only exposed during the tsunami disaster. So have you got statistics to show that we've got mature people? They don't want to rely on CSSA. They want to be self-reliant. Are there ways, for example, for social workers to identify them? Now, currently, we can still drive. We can still get our driving license renewed, even when we are in the 90s. So what about people who don't want to rely on CSSA so that they get facilitated in finding work? I still have time, so please give us a brief reply to another point from me. And this is the Labor Department will be expanding the employment program for the middle-aged. It is said that subsidies will be extended to employers for part-time jobs. Please explain whether this will be regarded as collusion between the business sector and the government rather than a business-government cooperation. SFW. For the young old, we do encourage them to work. We resort to positive ways to encourage them, and we also provide incentives. We provide support to the elders. In the Labor Department, we'll be enhancing our employment services. We've got effective programs like the employment program for the middle-aged. It is a two-way initiative. We encourage the elders to join the labor force, and we also encourage the employers, because there's the misunderstanding that elders are not suitable to work. There's also the misunderstanding that elderly workers don't get insurance coverage. This is a wrong concept. So we are going all out. There will be publicity. There will be public education. We encourage the elders to be self-reliant, and we hope that we can publicize the idea of family members helping each other. So we hope that for those elders who would like to rejoin the labor force, they will be assisted and facilitated. For the Employees Retraining Board, this year's theme is to help the mature workers to rejoin the labor market. We'll carry out a survey to sound out the views of the employers, and we want to find out from employers about we want to find out from the mature employees as to what sort of jobs they're interested in. So towards the end of the year, we'll come back with something clear, and then we can identify programs that will be a win-win initiative. What about support to the employers? We're not worried that employers will abuse the program, because the employment program for the middle-aged has been proved to be successful. We believe that elders may not want to have full-time jobs, so it is appropriate to extend it to part-time jobs. We have very vigorous criteria. The subsidies will only be available for at most 6 months. Mr. Chen, the population policy isn't just about the population mix. I think it has to do with the relationship between the economic development and employment, as well as town planning, the planning of new towns. In the year 2000, that is more than a decade ago, Tianjuiwei used to be called the city of tragedy, and was all because of the poor town planning. Therefore, we have to live with a lot of employment problems. In the construction industry, there is a labor shortage. It has to do with population policy, economic policies, as well as the coordination of public works projects. There has been an imbalance, and therefore we have to live with the problems. In the 1990s, there were the 10 mega projects. There were also employment problems, underemployment problems, and also labor shortage. Later on, we had to count on the 150 daily quota to fill the gaps in relation to skilled and semi-skilled workers. So when it comes to population policy, if we don't make a coordinated effort, and if we don't regulate the arrival of migrants, if we don't have a say over it, then we can't be effective. In fact, in recent years, we've seen many more elders coming to Hong Kong, and they are aged above 60. The SWD has to be called in to help because NGOs find that they can't cope because we just don't know why they have allowed so many elderly migrants to come to Hong Kong. It is not just a question of a political issue. In fact, the government would regard it as something that they cannot have a say at all, and that's about the immigration issues. We have the 150 a day one-way permit quota. I think it is closely related to the question of population policy as well. So please do not give us the same old question because that won't solve the problem.
Yes, or Mr. Zhang. I'll take the floor first and I defer to Mr. Lai. By way of clarification, Mr. Chen referred to the 150. I think he's referring to the one-way permit holders. And there are many elderly people. I don't think this is the truth. 2014, the age profile is on average 32 for those coming on one-way permit, as opposed to the general average of 43. For the past 17 years, 98% of the WP holders are Hong Kong spouses or children. Now, for the elderly people represents only 1.9% of the total. So the situation is not like Mr. Chen said. This one-way permit scheme is basically for family union. If we have a shortfall of labor and we need to import labor into Hong Kong, we need to do it under the importation scheme. Like Mr. Zhang said, in the recent years, because of the infrastructural development, we have seen a shortfall in the construction industry in terms of workers. So we have the supplementary labor scheme. We have enhanced the scheme. However, we have to strike a balance between the interests of different sectors, and we have to have regard to the views on importation. We are treading carefully in this regard. Mr. Lai, we said many times that of these 150 quota, the profiles are basically the same year on year. Spouses and underage children and children with a right of a vote, they take up 98%. The remaining 1% are the children and the elderly who don't have anyone looking after them, and it works out to be 2 per day. So, Chairman, I've only 5 seconds. This is from the experience of the frontline social workers, the elderly people coming to Hong Kong seeking help. The number has been the highest for many years. So you might wish to have a look at this. Dr. N. Zhang, Chairman, from the newspapers, we learned that the happiest country in the world is Switzerland. The reason why they are so happy is because in terms of the population policy, if they find that the population is not enough, they will encourage childbirth. If the population is too much, then they would withdraw certain immigration policies. What about Hong Kong? In Hong Kong, the population growth has been pretty slow. It's about the same level as Switzerland. I get the feeling that in Hong Kong, the healthcare, education, housing, and other policies, are they in keeping with the population growth? I do have a nagging doubt in my mind. I'd like to put this to the CS. I remember many years ago, I heard from the former CE, Mr. Donald Tsang, that he would like to see a population size of 10 billion at some point, although we're not sure when. In this document, in 2041, we're going to have 7.9 million people in Hong Kong, close to 8 billion. Now, my question for the CS is that right? If this is the case, 2041 is something like 2 decades away in terms of education, housing, healthcare. Are we well enough prepared for that? CS? The population projection is that in 2041, including the foreign domestic helpers, that the number is 8.469 million. We have this population projection from the Census and Statistics Department, and these statistics would be important for the policy bureaus in terms of their planning, in terms of housing supply, healthcare, education, and all the rest of it. We do need to have the projected figures to work out the demand. The Census and Statistics Department also conducts a census or by census every 5 years to bring the statistics up to date, like whether the projections need to be suitably adjusted. So to respond to Dr. N. Zhang's question, our services are planned on the basis of the population projection. Now, the projections might change as we go along, and the services may not be able to catch up with the population growth. So the policy bureaus will have to work very hard, like housing. We have the 10-year housing strategy. We do have the plan provision of 480,000 in the coming 10 years. Mr. Wong Kwok Kin. Chairman, I'd like to echo what Mr. Tommy Cheung said. Hardly ever do I echo what he has to say. However, this is something of concern to us. Ms. Chen Yunhan organized a year-end reunion dinner, and people talked about the dental vouchers, but the government is saying that there is a shortfall of dentists in Hong Kong. So should we allow the services to be dominated by certain sectors? There is also the reference to the talents list. I'm sure that this is dear and near to our heart. The formulation of a talent list is not sufficiently transparent. We have no idea how you put together this talents list. If you bring in the talents which are good for Hong Kong's creative industries, for instance, if they are good for Hong Kong's IT and they will provide more job opportunities for the young people, then we don't have any objection at all. But the question is, how does the government put together this talents list? Will the talents list be realistic, or is it something that the government is formulating behind closed door? There doesn't seem to be any transparent mechanism. CS? Let me take the first question first, and I'll be calling upon the SLW to talk about the talents list. As I said in answer to Mr. Tommy Cheung, I think that the government should liaise with the medical council. Now, for dentistry, it is the dental council and other medical practitioners will face the same problem. And depending on the needs in Hong Kong, and also having regard to the regulatory mechanism, they ought to come up with some ways and means to make sure that we can satisfy the demand for medical services. The Secretary for Food and Health is chairing the steering committee on the review of medical personnel, and it is conducting a review on the planning. The idea is to make sure that our medical system will continue to develop in a sustained manner, and this we will continue to work hard on. As LW Chairman, in terms of the talents list, the LWB is following up on this. If members recall, the Chief Executive said in the policy address that we would look at the feasibility study in terms of the formulation of a talents list. So the LWB, together with other bureaus, have just got started with the work. Now, this is an onerous task. We have to have regard to the success stories in other jurisdictions, what examples we can learn. It might take a bit of time. The talents list that is circulated in the media is not correct. We don't have any preconceived ideas. Like the policy address said, we are looking at the high value added areas like finance and other spheres. So we need a bit of time to conduct the study, which has already begun. Mr. Wong, do we have any transparent mechanism? Will there be any consultation on the sectors? At least we know how you put together the list. Secretary, indeed, we would consider the sectors because they are the users. We need to have the statistics. We need to know where in the high value-added areas there is a shortfall. Mr. Wong, will the stakeholders be roped in and take part in the formulation process of the talents list? Secretary, we will take into account the views of the professionals, the stakeholders, and the economic situation, the vacancies, and also the growth areas. It's going to be a comprehensive study which will take time. Mr. Yu Siwing. Chairman, thank you. The jobless rate is hovering around 3.3. A lot of sectors are running short of workers. The aging population, the government's burden is getting ever heavier. So the extension of the working life is really two birds with one stone. And in the document, it refers to the measures. And for retirement age, some will go up to 60 or 65 for the security personnel. The retirement age is going to go up to 70. There will be job fairs to lure more retirees to go back to the labor force. However, if the retirement policy can be extended to the private sector, it would be a good idea. But the private sector would have a lot of concerns. They are concerned that once they've started, there is no going back. Let's say the retirement age is extended to 65 and the economy is bad, they cannot retract it. Like someone is earning $30,000 on retirement, he may not earn $30,000. He may be earning $15,000. And there is also the continuity and also the succession plan on the part of the private sector. And they do have a lot of concerns. I'm wondering whether the administration can take the lead and cooperate with some large corporations for the retirement age to be extended to 65. Under the MPF, it is 65. Now, some will have it at 55, some 60. If we can bring in the corporations and encourage them to extend the working life of the workers under the aegis of the government, perhaps we can have some principles formulated and we can put together some standard or indicative pay for the retirees if they want to join the workforce again. And all the nitty-gritty can be worked out. And some guidelines can be made available to the private sector. I think if there is a norm put together a lot of the private sector companies would be prepared to hire all these retirees. Now we can extend the working life of the workers, and the private sector corporations will not face so much pressure. Perhaps the government might wish to consider this idea.
Yes. In Hong Kong, we don't have a law to mandate the retirement age in the private sector. Therefore, to a certain extent, what we think is that the Hong Kong government is the largest employer, so we'll be taking the lead and would like to extend the retirement age of civil servants. In fact, we do encourage all sectors to extend their retirement age. Currently, we have got different programs, activities, and publicity campaigns to promote the idea of having family-friendly policies. So for what Mr. Yu is saying, that is, he would like the government to be more proactive in encouraging the businesses and sectors to extend the retirement age, or in the case of what Mr. Matthew Cheung has referred to, that is the employment of the young olds, I think we'll be more than happy to do this. Mr. Yu. Well, we are in the business sector. Well, we always know that we will be subject to a lot of pressure if we are to do it first. I think it's better for the government to identify those enterprises that are interested, and then they make a start, and other enterprises will be happy to follow suit. This is not going to be mandatory, so it is a matter of taking a position. So perhaps the government can try to see if this can be done. SLW. As the CS has said, the Labour Department is going all out to publicize the idea of family-friendly employment measures. And we have got thousands of enterprises joining the effort. We're encouraging the enterprises to allow the mature workers to extend their retirement age. Maybe we can sort of do it with a greater depth and breadth. Mr. Kwok Wai Keung. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I may talk about the importation of labor. Currently, for skilled workers, we work through the general policy as well as the supplementary labor scheme to get foreign labor to come to Hong Kong. For such workers, their bargaining power is relatively low. So we have to emphasize that whatever importation schemes we have got for labor, the Labor Advisory Board should be the gatekeeper. On this occasion, be it the SLW or the CS4A, I think they've both said that the Labor Advisory Board will be asked to keep the gate. But I know that the government is going to introduce more supplementary labor scheme. I just want to supplement that in future all importation schemes must go through the Labor Advisory Board. And before the policies are promulgated, all sectors and the Labor Advisory Board should be consulted before you go ahead. Then for the general employment policy, as well as the admission scheme for mainland talents and professionals, we have already have 88,000 such talents coming to Hong Kong. I think the government of Hong Kong would like to attract them to stay behind. But then for the 88,000 talents and professionals from the mainland, I'm afraid that they are also acting as a barrier for the upward mobility of our younger generation. For the quality migrants as well as the mainland talents and professionals, I don't think we've seen any clear criteria for admission. I'm afraid that there will be and there has been abuse, so much so that younger people are denied adequate opportunities to move socially upwards. So I want to know if you're going to impose more regulatory initiatives so that within the various admission schemes will be safeguarded. That is, the younger generation will still have the space and opportunities to move socially upwards. SLW and S4S. Let me first of all talk about the Labour Advisory Board. Mr. Kwok, I think you know that our policy is clear. We want to safeguard the interests of our local workers. They will have job security and their wages will not be adversely affected. The two would be borne in mind before we introduce foreign labour in trades where we have a shortage of labour. So we won't depart from this principle in the mechanism and will respect the existing setup. Mr. Lai. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Under the General Employment Policy and under the admission scheme for mainland talents and professionals, we always say that unless it is only when the employer cannot get employees locally, then they can apply for the importation. Has all along been the policy. In Hong Kong, we know that for this city to maintain our economic growth, there is a genuine need for the admission of talents. Well, under the GEP as well as the admission scheme for mainland talents and professionals, well, we may have fluctuations year in, year out, but then over the years, the figures are rather stable. Sometimes we do have fluctuations. This is because when the economy is booming, then of course there is a tight labor market locally. And for enterprises to maintain their business activities, they may need to turn overseas to get professionals and talents from outside. You must understand that for the boss to get someone from outside, in addition to paying the wage, since the employee doesn't have the family in Hong Kong, so more has to be given to attract the talents from outside, say, for example, paying for accommodation, etc. And then for talents from outside of Hong Kong, they come, but they don't stay forever. In fact, we have seen that some of them may work in Hong Kong for a period of time, and then after they've completed a contract, they may choose to leave Hong Kong. And allow me to say that we have a quota of 1,000 under the QMAS, and for many years we've only used less than 400. So we haven't seen a drastic jump in the number of migrants. But then 800, a lot have already come. You can't deny that the younger generation hasn't been affected. Mr. Tommy Cheung has said that for the Medical Council, it is now holding 2 exams instead of 1 per year, but still the figure has only gone up from 40 plus to 70 plus a year. We have got very experienced doctors practicing overseas. They won't come to Hong Kong to sit the licensing exam. I think it's a matter of protectionism. They are ignoring the interests of Hong Kong. In the paper, it has been said that to encourage overseas talents to come to Hong Kong, perhaps we have to amend the point scoring system of the QMAS so that graduates from elite universities will be attracted to come. I think if we can do this, then it will be very effective. That is by changing or revising the marking scheme. Say we might have a Harvard graduate from the medical school. It is a well-recognized elite university. And yet if you ask this Harvard graduate to sit the exam, I don't think his standard will be lower than that of a local graduate. So I would like to see how the marking scheme will be revised. And then we need to attract overseas investors to come here to set up businesses. There was a very good example. There's this Mr. Wang Tao. He was a graduate of the Hong Kong UST in year 2006. And then he had set up this enterprise called Dajiang. He had wanted to stay in Hong Kong to start his business, but then he didn't find land and policies to support him. He returned to Shenzhen, and now he has got a business of dozens of billions of dollars in as short as less than a decade's time. Now we're encouraging investors to come here to set up businesses, but then we haven't got the policy. So how come that you can really claim that there will be innovative and creative people coming to Hong Kong to set up their business? Let me answer the first question, and then as for S, we'll talk about the marking scheme. Yes, we have suggested that the marking scheme should be revised to make sure that graduates of an internationally recognized and renowned higher educational institutions or those with international work experience will be sort of more assisted. But I don't think that can address the problem of the licensing exam for medical practitioners. So we still have to work with the SFH. Now, for the point made by Mr. Zhong, well, for 3 years since the election of the CE, has been trying to set up the Innovation and Technology Bureau, hoping that with a bureau dedicated for that purpose, we can talk about the innovation policies, and we can also create a favorable environment for innovative industries. So we'll urge members to enable the government to set up the Innovation and Technology Bureau as early as possible, so that in terms of innovation technology, in terms of creative industries, we can provide even more opportunities for our young people. Mr. Lai. For the marking scheme under the QMAS, indeed, we're going to revise the marking scheme. Say, for example, if we have got graduates of an internationally recognized and renowned university, more marks will be given. The purpose is to make it attractive to him. And then if the applicant has got international work experience, again, more marks will be given so that we will be attractive to such applicants. So by giving more marks, it means that they will find Hong Kong a good place for them to develop themselves. We have already got the agreement of the relevant committee. So the next step will be to enhance our publicity. As I have said, we've got 600 places left as far as the 1,000 strong quota is concerned. We have received many applications, but we haven't given approval in too many cases. This is because we want to make sure that the quality migrant applicants really possess the qualifications that we are looking for. Mr. Kenneth Leung, for the talent list, will the government be taking the lead to carry out a study concerning manpower planning in the various professions and industries? Otherwise, it would not be scientific enough. And then for the talent list, I don't think it is just a matter of finding out where we have got vacancies in our trades and professions. I think we should look at the future situation. There are students, say, for example, reading clinical psychology. This is because more and more citizens in Hong Kong are getting unhappy. In New York, many citizens would like to turn to clinical psychologists to talk. I'm sure you will agree with me if you have seen the movies of Woody Allen. And then for another question, and that's about the second generation of Hong Kong residents who have moved overseas. And please turn to page 28 of the report. Please go to footnote 2. It is said that for the second generation of our Hong Kong migrants, it is said that they have to be conversant in Chinese and English in both the spoken language and the written language. Please confirm whether it is both Chinese and English or Chinese or English. Now, if they're able to find a job in a year's time, then they may remain in Hong Kong. Does it mean that after getting their first job, they may freely change jobs in Hong Kong without having to get a work visa? Let me answer the first question about talent list. Mr. Leung is right. It is a complex issue. Therefore, we need time, in particular for important professions like the jobs in the financial services industry. We have to be sure about the future growth areas. We need to study the matter. We can't simply look at the figures on their own. But then as to whether we need a manpower survey in each and every sector, we may not have time to be so comprehensive, but then we can talk to the chambers of commerce, the professional bodies. We can keep our dialogue with them. They know about their needs, and then we can talk to the employers, the users, etc. And then we can analyze the information. Our economists can also carry out the analysis for us, and then we can put together the thoughts, and then it means that we can't finish the job within a short period of time, and it will take time before we can be sure of the feasibility.
Mr. Lai, thank you. To answer Mr. Leung's question, I think we have to make it clear that they should be able to speak and write Chinese, and they also have to be able to write and speak English. The second part is we allow them to stay for 1 year, and when they seek an extension, if they've got a job, we will extend their stay, although we will not restrict them to working for one single company. When they first come in, within a year, they can look for jobs, and there is no such a restriction. Mr. Leung, so once he's got a job, he doesn't need to have a work visa. He can change jobs as he goes along. And in other words, if he's got a job, he can stay in Hong Kong. Mr. Lai. Now, it's like the extension pattern. Let's say we give them an extension of 2 to 3 years, and within this period of time, he can change jobs. And when he seeks a further extension, he has to fulfill the original condition. He has to hold down a job and stay in Hong Kong. Mr. Prince Yuping. Chairman, thank you. The government emphasized that in terms of labor policy, the government would respect the views of the Labor Advisory Board. The LAB is looking at the importation scheme. The government doesn't seem to be able to achieve a consensus regarding the importation. Para 8P, it says that in the second quarter of 2015, the government plans to launch these measures as early as possible. In absence of any LAB consensus, will the government still launch these measures nonetheless, or will the government have regard to the consensus at LAB? Second, in relation to family-friendly policies to encourage women to work, of course we support services for child care. One of the important elements is to amend the 4118 employment conditions, and the other thing is the formulation of the standard working hours. will the CS be amending the employment ordinance in relation to 4118 and also the formulation of standard working hours, SLW? Chairman, Mr. Poon, for the importation of skilled labor, the Development Bureau, in fact, went to the LAB for a report, and there was a pretty good communication. The Development Bureau would have regard to the views of the labor sector in order to enhance the scheme. We hope that we will be work things out within this quarter. It's going to be a win-win situation. The labor sector has a lot of concerns, and a lot of these concerns will not come to pass because all these imported workers have to be skilled workers, and second, they have to be workers where we have a shortfall in Hong Kong, and the 4 weeks cannot be done away with, and also stick with the LAB mechanism. It's only that we streamline the procedures. When the workers come into Hong Kong, we will make it flexible. In terms of deployment, the approval procedures will be very, very stringent. By the end of the year, the Construction Industry Council will have an attendance card for the workers. There will be a labor relation officer who will be in charge of the auditing. The Labor Department will crack down on any abuses. If there is any abuse, the applicant will be blacklisted. So all these string of measures will ensure that we can address the concerns of the labor sector. It's going to be a win-win situation. There will not be any impact on the local workers. On the 4118 and the standard working hours, we understand the aspirations of the labor sector. Now, this 4118 employment situation, the LAB has different views. The Labor Department will look into this in order to forge a consensus. Standard working hours, I'm grateful to the committee for having done so much. The committee headed up by Dr. Leung Chee-hong. All the LAB members are represented there. I think we need to give them enough time to come up with specific proposals regarding the way forward. Definitely, a report will be submitted to the government with specific recommendations. Mr. Poon, the 4118 conditions, will this be presented to us? I know that the LAB has been discussing this. Mr. Poon, we have to go back to the LAB. There were diverse views without any consensus. The Labor Department will work hard going forward. In the absence of any consensus at the LAB, it doesn't make sense to bring this to the manpower panel. Please give us some time. We will work things out. Mr. Poon, they've been discussing this for a year and failed to achieve any consensus. Perhaps the government can step in and try to work out a consensus. Well, as I said, we do need some time. The Labor Department is working hard on this. Dr. Helena Wong. Chairman, para 10 of the paper says that the population policy covers so many different spheres. We do need to have a high-level coordination. The aging population is a fact of life. What we need is for the CS to coordinate at a high level all the different bureaus, and will be able to tell us the situation 20, 30 years down the line. We're going to have an aging population. We need new talents. When you next come here to the Council CS, you might wish to come up with some specific planning, including education, welfare, kindergarten, old folks' homes, and all the rest of it, or the daycare centers for the elderly and so on. Given these demographic changes, what provisions do you have in terms of software and hardware? In absence of this long-term plan, will it able to do anything about the aging population going forward. Now, with this fragmented package of measures, you will not be able to address the demographic challenges. So for the short term, medium term, and long term, how many more hospitals would there be? How many more old folks' homes would there be? How many more kindergartens would there be? How many more nurseries would there be? What sort of manpower will be needed? If you can come up with the data to us, we can have a more detailed discussion. CS. Thank you. Thanks very much, Chairman. I can say to Dr. Wong that this high-level mechanism does exist in the administration. I'm afraid the planning for different services is at different stages. If you ask us to make a report on the planning of different services, we are prepared to do so. But if you really want to cover every single area, welfare, elderly, and if you want the complete set of measures, you might need to wait a bit of time. Under Mr. Eddie Ng, there is a plan for free kindergarten education. The SLW is working on the provision for the elderly. Dr. Ko Wing Man is also dealing with the healthcare facilities. Perhaps after today's meeting, I can work out with the Bureau secretaries to come up with a holistic picture which will cover all the different spheres in the administration, but they have different completion dates. Dr. Wang, CS, you used to be heading the Development Bureau. We discussed all these policies in the panels. The many policy secretaries are expressing difficulties, citing a shortage of land. Like Mr. Matthew Cheung, he would like to have more old folks' homes, more facilities, but they run short of land. Kindergartens also, Mr. Eddie Ng, you must be aware of that. In Kai Tak, there is a housing estate with a population of 30,000. How many ground floor premises are available for kindergartens, for example? You must give us an undertaking as to how many homes will be available for the elderly people and how long is the waiting time. The same can be said about hospitals. In the absence of any timetable, in the absence of any planning, and you leave it entirely to the Bureau secretaries, then we don't have any high-level leadership. What you need to do is to have an undertaking. If there are young kids, you should give the undertaking that there must be places for them. For senior citizens, you must be able to come up with the undertaking regarding the waiting time. Orthopedics, the waiting time is 132 weeks or 900 days. And that's the waiting time for orthopedics. So you must give us the undertaking. Then it may be shortened to 60 weeks, 30 weeks, some sort of undertaking. It's no good for you to say that we are adopting this user pays principle. Don't you need to have a performance pledge? So, Ms. CS, you ought to have a strong word with your bureaus to come up with the undertaking before the population policy will be sustainable. Mr. Poche, Chairman, historically, economically, geographically, Hong Kong has always been an immigrant city. Recently, we heard that since the 79-day occupation movement, the immigration trend is really getting serious. Now, in terms of the trend of immigration, the paper seems to be silent on the situation. So I'm wondering whether we should have more data collected, like under the Registration of Persons Regulation 177A. It provides that those with Hong Kong permanent ID cards, the information like the residential address or business address, the nationality. Should there be any changes to this data, they should have the obligation to make a report to file the information. Otherwise, it would be a level 3 penalty and 3-year imprisonment. Hardly ever do we hear any implementation of this regulation. My question then is, why is it that this provision is not enforced? Or does the administration agree that without affecting or disrupting the public too much, we should appeal for the cooperation of the members of the public to update the information, and that would enable us to know more about the movement of our population? CS. Mr. Lai. Let me put it this way, Chairman. It is a fact of life that people keep changing their residential address. So we have to make sure that our record is up to date as to how many people are emigrating from Hong Kong to other places. If I recall, a long time ago, under the Registration of Persons regulation, if someone leaves Hong Kong permanently, he has to surrender his ID card, but this provision doesn't exist anymore. Anybody leaving Hong Kong, and given the freedom of movement, we would not ask them any questions. There are many Hong Kong people who have emigrated elsewhere, would be coming back to Hong Kong. There's also a fact of life.
So against such a background, indeed, as to who have left Hong Kong permanently, we don't have the information, and we can't sort of get the figure directly. I think this isn't unique to Hong Kong. The world has changed. For many Hong Kong citizens, they might have got the right of abode elsewhere. They will still come back to Hong Kong a number of times a year. They still maintain a home in Hong Kong. This is very, very common. So for the immigration laws, of course, we can try to step up our publicity so that we can be more accurate in our information. This is something that we can do. As to how many people have emigrated overseas and will never return to Hong Kong, well, I think I don't think it is realistic to try to do this against the current circumstances. Now we try to assess the number of people who have done so. I think we are not too far away from the accurate picture. Mr. Poche, I think the CE has said that every time he went to Shanghai and other major cities on the mainland, he would certainly meet with the Hong Kong citizens who have settled there. We always try to ask how many people have done so, and he will always say that he can never tell. So this is different from the Secretary's reply. I think we want to know more about the habits, the preferences of our visitors. But what about our own people? And we have, in fact, got a piece of legislation to govern this. How come that we are not enforcing the law? Secretary, we don't have a rule to say that if a Hong Kong citizen is to live overseas, whether it is for the purpose of emigration, for work or for study, etc., and that he has to declare to the authorities in Hong Kong by registering with our economic and trade officers. We don't actually have such a requirement. In some countries, they do encourage the citizens or nationals to do in a similar way, but they have never been able to really do that. Dr. Lo Wai Kwok. In the year 2018, the labor force will peak at 3.17 million, and then it will drop before it stabilizes. Now, we have got a population which is aging, and then for 1,000 workers, they have to support 371 children and elderly dependents. In fact, the figure will worsen in the year 2041, so that there will be 712 dependents per 1,000 economically active citizens. So there's an offsetting trend. What will be done to make sure that we've got sufficient public resources to resolve the problems of livelihood? It is indeed a tall order. Therefore, we need to develop our manpower resources. Time and again, we've been comparing ourselves with Singapore. Last year, Singapore set up a Skills Future Council. They've set up the Skills Future Council. And then under the Labour Bureau, they also set up a Lifelong Learning Council. So for the Skills Future Council, it is being headed by the Deputy Premier. In other words, they have high-level coordination insofar as manpower development is concerned. We also understand that for the Lifelong Learning Council has been visiting Hong Kong. There has been exchange sessions. I think we need to know in what areas we should catch up. So my question for the CS4A is that, are you going to do what Singapore has done? That is to have a high-level coordinator to take care of education and manpower issues. Currently, this work is being distributed among different policy bureaus. And in fact, the manpower development in different industries is carried out among different policy bureaus. Yes, CS4A, you're supposed to be very capable, but then you're supposed to eradicate poverty, oversee West Kowloon Cultural District and the population. I don't doubt your ability, but you have only got so much time in your hands. Thank you, Chair. I went to Singapore for a visit, and I, in fact, met with the Deputy Premier who is responsible for this portfolio. We met, we also visited their department overseeing population issues. They have got a senior official equivalent to our Permanent Secretary to assist the Deputy Premier to do this. So it is quite different from what I've got here. I'm sort of like doing it on a part-time basis. I don't rule out the possibility or the need to enhance our support. I'm not trying to go back to history, but in fact, the CE had asked for a Deputy Secretary's post to be created so as to oversee manpower issues. But of course, the idea hasn't been endorsed. But still, as the head of the SCPP, I will certainly do my utmost. But of course, when time comes, we'll try to see how the institutional setup can be enhanced. I believe that for the next term of the government, population policy will still be very important and would require high-level coordination. I thank Dr. Low for his suggestion. Mr. Chairman, I'm grateful to the CS for telling us that she will certainly spare no efforts in enhancing the work. She will have my support. The reality is many sectors in Hong Kong, they have got great potential economically, are suffering from manpower shortage, construction industry being one of them. And then aircraft maintenance is another example. We have got a long history with excellent abilities, but then as a result of manpower shortage, the development has been constrained. So we need to do something about it. So I hope that you can escalate the level of coordination. We will certainly support you. Mr. Ronnie Tong, we are grateful to the CS4A for finding time in her busy schedule to tell us about the population policies. But then from her speech and from the documents, we are really disappointed. This is because we have seen fake slogans or cliches. And then for subsidized education, I think she's still repeating what we have got in the policy address last year. For this year's policy address, we've criticized the inadequate subvention for the self-financing programs. It isn't going to help the young people a lot, and this is not facilitating social mobility. Now, there is this idea to extend the retirement age of the civil servants, and it's hoped that the private sector will follow suit. I wonder if the government has carried out any assessment here. Now, if the government is going to get its way, there is a lot of people will be retiring at an older age. Will it have an impact on the number of vacancies? Now, young people have asked me this question. If many people choose not to retire, it means that young people will find it difficult to find jobs, because the government hasn't told us as to what will be done to increase the number of jobs. So can the government present some figures for us so that young people who are eagerly looking for a job will have their minds put at ease? Do you have the figures, and have you carried out such an assessment? CS or SLW? Well, let me share with you one figure. The latest unemployment figure, as announced yesterday, was 3.3%. So for 9 seasons in a row, we are approaching full employment, with jobless rate standing at 3.3%. And every day, the Labour Department received requests for applicants for thousands of jobs, spanning over different educational attainment levels. So employment won't be a problem. It is a matter of your willingness to work. If you're being too choosy, then of course it is a problem. In fact, there are still a number of vacancies in the market. As to retirement policies, we haven't got a specific policy for the private sector. I'm sure we'll always be flexible. Now, we have got the Secretary for Civil Service here. We are talking about new retirement age of 65 for new recruits. For the serving civil servants, it is a case-by-case question. So the impact won't be that huge. Now, Secretary, you haven't got the figures with you, but you believe that if we are to extend the retirement age by 5 years across the board, both in the government and in the private sector, you believe that we are not able to catch up with the unemployment rate? Can you present us with specific figures? I'm not saying that definitely this is not going to happen, but then this is going to be a gradual process, and the impact will be limited. Not everybody will want to retire later, and it is a matter of personal choice and also their health reasons. There are also colleagues who have said that when they reach the age of 60, they won't be interested to extend their retirement age, even if they have been invited to stay. I hope the Secretary will provide the data from any studies that you are carrying out successfully. There's still time left. Let me answer Mr. Tong's question. I think he's saying that we haven't done enough in our policies. Let me say this: when it comes to public policy planning, we have to be aware of the constraints. As Dr. Helena Wong has said, land, manpower, and public resources are constraints that we have to bear in mind. I think you recall that the FS gave us the outcome of the long-term fiscal planning study. As a result of the question of aging of our population, even if there is no enhancement in our services, like cutting short the waiting time, well, in 10 years, there will be a structural fiscal deficit. He said so in relation to long-term fiscal planning. Secretary, I'm only talking about the resources. We are really rich. We have a lot of money, so we are indeed possible to expand our service. The last to speak, Dr. Fernando Zhang. We have got structural surpluses for many years. I find it difficult to understand why you are emphasizing structural fiscal deficit. Now, I want to talk about children. Now, you have said that there will be 5 strategies. You want to encourage the female and the elderly to join the workforce. You want to create a favorable environment so that citizens will be willing to form and raise a family. But then if you haven't got proper childcare services, this is not going to be easy. We have got the Bohemia Foundation telling us that we have got a huge shortage of childcare places. For the age group 0 to 2, the ratio is 1 to 59. In other words, on average, 1 place for 59 children. For some districts, especially low-income districts, for example, Wong Tai Sin, Sai Kung, Kwun Tong, Tai Po, Tuen Mun, Sha Tin, the supply is even limited. You have got 1 place for over 100, 1 place per 100 children or more. So according to the study, now the government is not committed enough in relation to child care services, and the government hasn't got sufficient foresight. Last year, the Hong Kong CSS also published the findings of a study. It has been pointed out that 80 to 90 poor families in Hong Kong have seen their mothers having to stay home to take care of the children, and so they have to rely on one income for the entire family, and so they have to maintain a very low income level. Now, many of our CSSA families are such that they have young children at home, and then the breadwinner is just, they have only got 1 breadwinner. So if we don't improve our child care services, it means that the low-income families will not be given the help they need. Now, in your paper, you have said that you're going to have an additional 1,200 places for extended hours service. But then we aren't talking about additional places for more children. We are only talking about children already receiving the service. It is that they will have their service hours being extended to whole day service. So my question for the CS is that, do you have a comprehensive plan? Now, the figures from the 2 studies have said that currently we already need 100,000 more childcare places. So do you have a way to increase the number of places? Do you have any plans? Do you have any programs at all?
CS. I'll take the question briefly, and then I defer to Mr. Zhang about the planning. As Dr. Fernando Zhang quoted from the Poverty Commission, we conducted a study on the poverty situation in 2012. We became aware that there were so many low-income families in Hong Kong. The children that have to support are many in numbers. In the 2014 policy address, we have introduced the low-income family allowance. The idea is basically to help the children. We provide them with a monthly allowance. So the idea is similar to what Dr. Zhang suggested. We put the children at a very high priority. As to whether we have gone far enough, I think we have to face the reality that in terms of housing, resources and manpower, we do face constraints. However, we are increasing the level of services. We are providing the childcare services through different means. SLW. Mr. Zhang, in terms of childcare, we have to step up our effort. In the policy address, there is a whole string of measures which seek to redress the balance. If you notice the details It doesn't take into account the private sector places. There are 20,000 places there, and there are some middle-class households that are hiring domestic helpers to look after their children. So this is not a holistic picture. However, we do step up our effort. We have explained a series of measures at the Welfare Services Panel. That we extend the service to 8 p.m. and that would encourage the women to join the workforce, and that would increase the labor force in Hong Kong. Time is up. You might wish to take the matter up with the Secretary at the panel. Thank you very much, CS and her team, for joining us at the special House Committee meeting. 17 members put questions. We're going to have the House Committee regular meeting in 30 seconds.